So what was generally happening and what these files generally relate to is the relationship between the national security state and the various foreign policy initiatives that JFK was involved in. And so you see a lot of the role of the anti-Castro Cubans at the time in 1961. The Bay of Pigs had just happened. It was a bit of a disaster. It really put JFK at odds with his own CIA, who felt that JFK had betrayed the Central Intelligence Agency by not providing enough support, and that was the reason that it failed. And so there are many researchers in the sort of JFK assassination space take a close look at the role between the Central Intelligence Agency and the various assets at its disposal, including from the anti-Castro Cuban community. But the thing that I find most relevant to today, among so many other things in these files, gets to the heart of how intel work is structured and how many of the same institutions that are being penetrated by the CIA in these files are alive and well today and playing a major role in politics today, which gets to the question of, if the CIA had penetrated them that deeply back in the 1960s, how deeply are they still penetrated today? So when you see institutions, for example, like the AFL-CIO, which is the largest confederation of unions in the entire United States, being frequently cited as being chock full of CIA assets and the CIA running back and forth to the AFL-CIO. Well, the AFL-CIO was running the anti-Trump protests in 2020. They play a huge role in statecraft backing Lula over Bolsonaro in Brazil. The question is are they instruments of statecraft today as they were in the 1960s? There are other documents that reference, for example, the CIA's penetration of teachers and the teaching profession and the teachers' unions. There's one document that goes through the World Confederation of Organizations of the Teaching Profession and how the CIA had created front companies and shell groups in order to influence all the different teachers' unions in that World Confederation of Organizations of the Teaching Profession, and how even both the president and general secretary of that organization were CIA assets reporting directly to the CIA, and were given covert security approvals for that purpose, as well as the National Education Association. These are the largest teachers' unions in the United States today, and we know that based on these files that their entire senior leadership was CIA 60 years ago. They too are trying to stop Trump's shutdown of the Department of Education and are on the front lines organizing protests at the Department of Education building. A lot of this has to do with the CIA's international work, because these federal agencies like the Department of Labor's International Affairs Branch and the Department of Education's International Affairs Branch work to control the education systems in foreign countries in order to control hearts and minds and swing elections in the favor of whatever the foreign policy establishment wants, whoever they want to win that election, or to vote yes or no on a particular bill in a foreign country's National Assembly. But among those sort of individual federal agencies that we see are alive and well today, and I should mention one more, another one is HHS, which at the time I believe was called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Bobby Kennedy is now the head of the Department of HHS, which is the new name for that same agency. What we saw is that the second ever head of HHS, Oveta Culp-Hobby, in these documents is revealed to have been secretly working for the CIA and bundling money for the CIA, given a covert security approval to run CIA money through one of her own foundations. And so we see this legacy where it's not just the CIA itself, it's all these other departments, it's all these other institutions. And the one that I want to, I think, focus on in sort of telling this story over the rest of our time here is on the relationship between CIA and USAID. And Mario posted a great summary of a June 8th, 1961 meeting that takes place shortly after the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. Mario describes this as the secret 1961 meeting that shaped U.S. covert operations. On June 8th, 1961, a secret eyes-only document that had CIA Director Allen Dulles, the National Security Advisor, folks from the State Department and Pentagon forming a special group. In this document, 5 months before JFK created USAID, and this is another thing, which is that with the JFK files are being released at an interesting time, given that there's the question about how do you shut down USAID? It was created by executive order. Can't it just be undone in an executive order? And of course, it was JFK's executive order that initially established this. But what you see is 5 months before JFK created USAID, in this meeting, you see the tension between the CIA and the State Department. Now the CIA doesn't need to exist. You could do that same function out of the State Department if there was an easy way to conceal the funds and maintain plausible deniability. If you go back to 1948, the CIA's origins were that it was conceived of effectively by the State Department. It was conceived of in terms of its political cloak and dagger, black operations, political subversion work. There's a memo called The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare by George Kennan, who's the same State Department policy planning staff director who would author the NSC 10-2, the National Security Council 10-2, the famous memo that granted the CIA plausible deniability, that they could do all manner of black propaganda, fake news, arson, economic sabotage, demolition, you name it, all manner of criminal deeds, as long as they carried out the operations so as to allow the U.S. government to plausibly deny the U.S. government's involvement. So basically, the CIA was given by the State Department a license to commit crimes as long as they got away with it. But the fact is as George Kennan laid out in 1948, this was a State Department function, but it was delegated to the Central Intelligence Agency to do. At the end of the day, the State Department has to approve, because whatever you're doing through the Central Intelligence Agency has to be consistent with the U.S. foreign policy set out by the State Department. And what you see here in June 1961 is that the CIA was constantly having its approval conditioned on provisions set forth by the State Department. So, for example, this meeting starts out by talking about Congo and how the State Department was conditioning its approval of the acceptance of the CIA's plans on 3 provisions that the State Department set forth in a memo. And you see Allen Dulles, the CIA director's reticence to accept those conditions. Then it goes on to Allen Dulles, the CIA director, notes that there were previous reservations of the State Department and it had been considered but not approved 3 times previously. So the CIA is being denied by the State Department the ability to do what it wants. And you can see that Allen Dulles, the CIA director, is concerned about that, is flustered, is frustrated by it. And that goes on to say, Mr. Dulles noted that the pertinent NSC paper, that's the National Security Council, which is the White House. The National Security Council, in this, in present day, that means the Trump White House. At the time, it was the JFK White House, because all the different agencies have to answer to the White House at some level. That level, that higher authority, is the National Security Council. So it says, Mr. Dulles noted that the pertinent NSC paper, National Security Council paper, authorized programs such as that under discussion, but emphasized that he would only undertake this activity if it was fully supported by the State Department and higher authority, which is going to mean the National Security Council, the White House. Mr. Dulles said, however, that he felt that the special group should have some latitude to make decisions on these matters within the general policy, which might be laid down by higher authority, like the White House, without referral of each specific case for approval. Meaning what the CIA wants is a general foreign policy set by the White House, and then autonomy over how you carry out all the individual actions associated with that general policy. As we get to the USAID part of the story, you'll see how this can go so wrong so fast. But then at the bottom it says, Mr. Bundy reiterated the decision that the covert annexes should not be processed through the National Security Council machinery. And then he notes the action of the CIA, political action operations in friendly areas. Now, this idea that you want dirty deeds done, but not, quote, processed through the NSC machinery, is suggesting that they don't want to have to require White House approval to do these covert actions. And lo and behold, just 5 months after this meeting, you would see the creation of the U.S. Agency for International Development, which does not have a seat on the National Security Council, is not processed through the so-called NSC machinery, therefore does not need White House sign-off on all of its particular actions. And that was created just 5 months after this meeting, and at a time when there was a tremendous amount of CIA-adjacent activity happening, particularly in Southeast Asia. Just 2 weeks before JFK signed the executive order that created USAID, 2 weeks before that, he awarded the Green Beret to the Special Forces, and then just 1 month after he signed the executive order authorizing USAID, he would launch something called Operation Pincushion in December 1961, which was a Special Forces mission to recruit hillside guerrillas in Laos and Cambodia. And then the CIA took control over that Special Forces recruited hillside guerrilla violent paramilitary group. And by 1967, USAID was taking U.S. taxpayer money in the form of humanitarian assistance, paying for this violent paramilitary group to purchase CIA airliners from Air America and Continental Air Services. These are both CIA proprietary airliners, and they had their planes purchased by USAID to give to what turned out to be a narco-trafficking violent paramilitary group. The Vang Pao's CIA mercenary army there was taking the opium that was being grown on the Golden Triangle and using these CIA aircraft to sell drugs, to buy guns, to fight the war. And the U.S. Special Forces and Central Intelligence Agency and USAID appeared to have full knowledge of what they were doing with that aircraft and supported it because it helped get funding for the war that could not be appropriated by Congress. And so the fact is if you had to relay all those details to the president and the president didn't want to do it, then that operation could fail because the president doesn't want to get his hands so dirty. But if you have USAID, you can do this without the presidential approval. And so USAID is able to effectively set U.S. foreign policy entirely on its own as a completely rogue agency. And so from there, I want to now turn to this incredible document that's related in these JFK files, which is this famous 15-page Arthur Schlesinger memo called CIA Reorganization. Now, even that name of this memo, CIA Reorganization, is a very topical, relevant name because what we are doing right now is USAID reorganization. You could very easily take this same memo and just do Control F, find and replace for the word CIA with the word USAID, and it would fit right at home today. The concern with USAID is because it's an independent agency, it does not require presidential approval, a so-called presidential finding to sign off on all that its covert activities like the CIA does. It's effectively able to set U.S. foreign policy even if the White House disagrees. And so it creates a totally parallel power center for the people who run USAID to undermine the president, to have dual-track diplomacy when the president is supposed to be at the top of the chain of command. And so one of the things that's very interesting, now Arthur Schlesinger, he was a special assistant to the president. It was his formal title. He was known as a historian, but it's important to note that Arthur Schlesinger worked in the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA, and had intelligence experience himself coming into this. And he writes about the need to reorganize the Central Intelligence Agency because the CIA was setting its own independent foreign policy against the wishes of the president, which is the same thing that USA did to Trump term 1 and is very likely to do to Trump term 2 unless it's stopped. And so I want to read a few things here from this document that I find very fascinating. there's a section called the Control of American Sources, CAS. It says it represents a particular aspect of CIA's encroachment on policymaking functions. This is very important because if, for example, Trump has a policy of wanting to knock out ISIS, and the folks in charge of USAID want to build up ISIS to use them to, for example, overturn or topple the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, then one policy conflicts with the other in a very major way. One is do drone strikes to take them all out. The other is to give them bundles of hundreds of millions of dollars to build them up. These two things have no overlap. One has to win. The American people voted for the White House. So obviously, if one agency is encroaching on the policymaking function of the White House, it has to be stopped. So it goes on to say the CIA today has nearly as many people under official cover overseas as the State Department, 3,900 to 3,700. About 1,500 of these are under State Department cover, and 2,200 are either under military cover or commercial or humanitarian group cover. So you have 1,500, that's about half of the CIA at the time was actually operating under State Department cover, so-called State Department attachés working out of embassies or consulates. And it goes on to say, originally the use of State Department cover for CIA personnel was supposed to be strictly limited and temporary. The Dulles-Jackson report stated in 1948, the CIA should not use State Department cover as a simple answer to all its problems, but should proceed to develop its own outside cover, and eventually in this way, and through increased efficiency of its overseas personnel, find a way to temper its demands on the State Department. Nonetheless, the CIA has steadily increased its requisitions for official cover. There are several reasons why CIA has abandoned its original intentions of developing systems of private cover. It's easier to arrange through state, it's less expensive, it's quicker, it facilitates secure communications, it ensures a pleasanter life for CIA people, but the effect is to further the CIA encroachment on the traditional functions of state. And this is what USAID was doing. It was encroaching on the traditional functions of state. This is the whole reason the Trump White House declared in effectively its first week that it was going to shut down USAID and move its function into state, because USAID had encroached on the functions of state and had nullified state effectively because of the inability to get appropriate approvals over USAID because of the secrecy inside the agency. So it goes on to say, in some missions, I understand, these undercover State Department CIA personnel outnumber regular State Department personnel. In the American Embassy in Vienna, out of the 20 persons listed in the Foreign Service list as being the political section, 16 are CIA. Now, this is very interesting because Victoria Nuland, after she was the Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasian Affairs during the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine in 2014, she was promoted to be the head of the entire political affairs section of the State Department. This very section that we see here in this Arthur Schlesinger memo on reorganizing the CIA was so problematic because in some cases, 80% of the people who claim to be State Department in this section are actually CIA. They're actually not really with the State Department. They are faking that they're with the State Department, but they're there as cover because they're really doing covert intelligence work. That should tell you a little something about Victoria Nuland, by the way, in terms of, what her true function was. She also, when she left the State Department Political Affairs branch, she then moved to be on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, which was the newer plausible deniability layer created for the CIA, just as the CIA was created as a plausible deniability layer for the State Department. She was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs during the Biden term from 2021 to 2024. So you see how it says in this Schlesinger memo, it says that 16 out of the 20 persons in the Vienna embassy are actually CIA. They call themselves State Department, but they're actually undercover for the CIA in the political section. And Victoria Nuland was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. That's in charge of the political section for all of the embassies and for main state in Foggy Bottoms. Then it goes on to say, and you see how systematic this is. Of the 31 officers listed as engaging in reporting activities, over half of them are CIA. So the State Department also has a media wing, effectively. This is the public relations, public diplomacy wing, as well as what we now call the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which houses Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, which Trump has also moved to shut down to significant resistance. And we see over half of the people claiming to work for those are CIA. Then it goes on to say, in Chile, of the 13 officers listed in Victoria Nuland's political section in our embassy in Chile, 11 out of 13 people claiming to work for the State Department, doing political work, political affairs, manipulating the internal politics of the country. 11 out of 13. That's 90%. Then it says, on the day of President Kennedy's inauguration, 47% of the political officers serving in U.S. embassies were secretly CIA. Sometimes the CIA mission chief has been in the country longer, has more money at his disposal, wields more influence, and is abler than the ambassador. This is what's happening today with the USAID mission chiefs. The USAID mission chiefs often wield more money than the ambassadors. They have $44 billion at their disposal and are focused on the political manipulation that comes with having a giant media arm at their disposal through things like Internews and OCCRP. They have the judges on their payroll. They have the unions on their payroll. They have the journalists on their payroll. They have public health systems on their payroll. If they can effectively be stronger than the State Department in different countries, depending on who's spending more cash on the region. And I'm going to get to specific examples of this when we zoom out and bring it back to present day. But it goes on to say, in the Paris embassy, now again, that was a friendly allied country, even though just a few years after this, the CIA would work to overthrow the government of Charles de Gaulle in France when he pulled France substantially out of NATO. But the CIA was very active in France throughout the Cold War. There was the so-called famous French connection, for example, with the drug laundering that was done with these French units processing drugs effectively through, for U.S. intelligence. But it says in the Paris embassy today, there are 128 CIA people. In the Paris embassy, 128 CIA people. CIA in Paris has long since begun to move into areas of political reporting normally occupied by state. The CIA men doing overt internal political reporting outnumber those in the embassy's political section by 10 to 2. CIA has even sought to monopolize contact with certain French personalities, among them the President of the National Assembly. CIA occupies the top floor of the Paris embassy, a fact known locally. And so this is the danger of having an independent agency that's supposed to serve the State Department, but is given a long leash to do covert operations, is that you now have a parallel set of points of contact. This is the President of the National Assembly, their version of our Congress. And the CIA, in that case, monopolized contact so that the State Department, who the CIA is supposed to serve, can't budge the affairs. They have to run it through their CIA contact. You see the same thing happening today with the USAID mission chiefs. There's another very interesting memo that was during the Obama administration. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, was big on a concept that she called the 3 Ds: diplomacy, defense, and development. And this was the merger of the State Department, the Pentagon, and USAID in order to influence the course of events in foreign countries, manipulate their politics, their executive branch, their legislative branch, their civil society institutions, that the 3 of these need to work together. And there's an assessment memo that was put out during the Obama administration that analyzed the efficacy of DOD, USAID coordination. And it interviewed various generals from the military and various USAID administrator level folks about how to improve the organization of the direct channels between the DOD and USAID. And there's a fascinating passage in there where during the Obama administration, one of the generals relayed that the U.S. military actually prefers to work with USAID over the State Department because USAID actually does stuff and because USAID is not subject to the knife fight in a toll booth that plays out at the NSC level. That is, it's because USAID work did not have to be processed through the NSC machinery, that phrase that we saw in 1961 that Allen Dulles and company were using at the CIA level. You see at the Pentagon level, they're saying we prefer to work with USAID because they don't have to go through the bureaucratic knife fight in a toll booth. They don't need to do, close quarters combat with the White House and all the different equities of the National Security Council. The National Security Council is the interagency that coordinates the Pentagon with the State Department, with the CIA, with the Justice Department, with DHS. Everyone has to provide their insight and get interagency approval. And because USAID essentially could move faster, it didn't require the approvals, we see the U.S. Special Forces preferring to work with USAID over the State Department. Well, that cuts the State Department out of the loop. This is how you result in situations like, as some generals bragged after Trump lost in 2020 and they began to go public with how they had hoodwinked Trump. There were reports in mainstream media where various generals were bragging that they were, quote, constantly playing shell games with the numbers in Syria and in Iraq with Trump in order to fool him into thinking that the military was doing one thing when in fact it was doing another. And what you see is when they are able to outsource to places like USAID, who can, for example, fund hundreds of millions of dollars to terrorist groups, as we've seen publicly reported by so many watchdogs at this point, and they can keep it all in-house because it's not processed at the NSC level, and they are able to have an effective carte blanche. So if the Pentagon wants something done, but they think that the NSC machinery will gum it up or not approve, they can simply walk over to USAID and have USAID do it, which is another reason that USAID did not want to give up its internal documents or its internal records or let DOGE into the building. Well, we're in a strange time right now because there was an incredible amount of momentum on this. If you think of it like an octopus, it may have a twisted mind, but what allows it to do what it does is that it has 8 different legs that can, carry out various operations. If you simply take the legs out, it can think whatever evil thoughts it wants, but it can't actually execute them. And that, I believe, was the real strategy, the linchpin of the strategy behind the Trump and Elon and DOGE attempt to rein in USAID. If you cut its staff from 14,000 down to 290 hand-picked ones, then you have 13,700 less arms to do that dirty work. They can only do so much. Similarly, if you slash its budget from $44 billion down to a pittance of that, you have now slashed the money arms of the octopus to pay to set up these CI front group operations. The issue is just this week, a district court judge appears to have forced the continuation of USAID. We all watched as the lettering was taken off of the building. USAID, it had its name taken off the Ronald Reagan building. The staff had to evacuate effectively. We shut down all the overseas headquarters buildings in all the different countries and had the staff all together with their families have to fly back to the United States. The question is what happens now, given that this rogue judiciary is appearing to force USAID back online? What is the counter response to that? Well, there's one way that you could take this out, even if it's going to take a couple months or take till the end of the year, is there is going to be a budget fight over this. And this is where pressure on Congress is going to play a big role. If USAID is forced for the time being to continue, and its whole lifeblood is the $44 billion of allocation it gets every year in the budget, Congress can simply vote to zero out that budget. You could simply elect to not fund the agency for fiscal year 2026, and it would be dead by default. The question is are members of Congress going to be brave enough to do that? Is there enough of a pressure valve or an inducement to maintain a majority in Congress to vote against that? And this is going to be one of these dogfights that's going to reveal the true strength of the MAGA movement inside of Congress, whether it has as much momentum as it currently appears to have, or whether or not, there's going to be a sort of Soros versus Musk fight over threats of primarying people who vote against shutting down USAID. Are there inducements that Democrats are going to make to the internationalist Republican side of the other side of the aisle to try to poach, the John Thune faction or the John Cornyn faction or the Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins faction? And so there's a lot of dog left in this fight. The easy win appears to be foreclosed on for now because of this judicial ruling that just happened, and the Supreme Court appears to be wayward itself, so it's unclear how the Supreme Court, if they even take the case on this USAID shutdown, would rule. So the best option that we have is making sure that at the end of the day, no matter what, Congress shuts it down while we work on executive and judicial solutions in the interim. Kennedy was, in some ways, the godfather of U.S. Special Forces work. As I mentioned, 2 weeks before Kennedy signed the executive order establishing USAID, he awarded the Green Beret to the Special Forces. And then 1 month after creating USAID, he launched Operation Pincushion to do this small wars Special Forces work in Southeast Asia, in this Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam area. And to this day, at Fort Bragg, the Special Forces Center is called the John F. Kennedy Special Forces Training Center. It was JFK who really fully transitioned the U.S. into a so-called small wars model, which is this idea that the U.S. has to transition from thinking about its special operations in terms of tanks and fighter jets, but really thinking of it in terms of paramilitaries and control over local governments and control over the local indigenous populations in places that we operate to get the support of the local population. Now, that is what merges the Special Forces with USAID in such a serious way. As I mentioned, during the Obama administration, you've got quotes from high-ranking military generals that they prefer to work with USAID over the State Department when they do this kind of work. The USAID can get into areas that the State Department can't because it's not formal U.S. diplomacy. It's simply a humanitarian group. It also operates through multiple layers of NGOs that don't represent themselves as government agents. And so they have more credibility with the local populations. They can provide, grants and sub-grants much more fluidly. There's much less oversight, so they can fund dirty actors. For example, if a local warlord is in control of the territory, or a narco gang is in charge of the territory, or, violent, murderous paramilitaries are, it might be a diplomatic incident to give them a State Department grant because that's formal U.S. diplomacy rewarding, indirectly financing drug networks, people committing genocide, people caught in corruption webs. But if USAID is doing it as a distribution of humanitarian funds to the local population, and they just happen to be the senior leaders over those local populations, then USAID can get away with it. That then juices up the skids of the financial ecosystem for these indigenous groups. And so that gets them on our payroll and establishes that favors for favors relationship, that if they want to keep getting the money, they'll do what USAID wants. And so they will follow the policy set forth by USAID, even if that's not the policy being recommended by the U.S. State Department. But I do think that JFK was keenly aware of this need to get into areas where we were conducting small wars and provide financing under humanitarian cover. We saw, for example, that decades later, this would become championed. But Henry Kissinger wrote a book in 2000 about how much of the 1990s, the soft power wins achieved by the U.S. were effectively accomplished by USAID and under cover of private philanthropy and under cover of humanitarian interventions, rather than through a traditional national security predicate. And so I think JFK did have that in mind. I think that he, however, wanted the oversight mechanisms to be more proper. And that's really, I think, what Trump's vision is as well. I think the problem with USAID is not that it has the power to do what it does, but that it has the power to do what it does without State Department approval, without White House approval, that they can fool the White House, they can fool the State Department by simply not reporting what they're doing, or saying they're doing one thing but doing something else, and then not turning over the documents because they're an independent agency and they don't have to. And so I think what Trump is actually doing is trying to, by moving it into the State Department, trying to fulfill the original JFK vision, to still have a function that provides funding for U.S. interests under cover of humanitarian NGO work, but simply have White House control and oversight over where those funds go. Sometimes it's that countries don't, they're caught in a bind because they want the money, but they don't want the strings attached. That's actually the best case scenario with USAID funding. A lot of times USAID is forced on countries even though they don't want it, and they don't have a choice because they're under the barrel of, for example, IMF debt or World Bank debt. That is, a lot of these are poor countries in conflict zones that owe a lot of money to the global banker set through the International Monetary Fund and its various affiliates. And oftentimes the conditions that are set on countries are that they have to accept these NGOs to take control of various sectors of civil society, to take control of their education system, their public health system, their journalist class, key geographic regions, like, for example, a lot of times these water irrigation programs or these famine relief programs where USAID puts boots on the ground to, set up buildings and tents and security forces in the areas. You effectively gain control over these sensitive areas when you do it. But a lot of times it's effectively forced on countries because they need money to be relieved of a debtor burden. And the only way that they can keep themselves financially solvent is by accepting the relinquishing of their sovereign control over their own country in exchange for the USAID funds with the USAID forces attached to that. So I think that there are many cases where countries would still want to accept USAID when those conditions are acceptable. You could imagine, for example, in Argentina. Argentina is a country where there is an alliance, I believe, between the Trump White House and the Malay government. There's a very friendly relationship, it appears, for example, also between Javier Milei and Elon Musk. Argentina also owes something like $15 billion to the IMF. It's one of the largest debtors and has has defaulted something like 9 times and is being forced because of that debt to move forward with privatization of national assets that it holds. And you could imagine a deal being struck where the U.S. provides additional financial assistance in the form of USAID to Argentina, and in exchange, Argentina relinquishes part of its sovereign control over certain aspects of its civil society to allow U.S. soft power influence into the region. The U.S. does this, by the way, effectively with China. China has leapt in and exploited the opportunity left by California's failing economic systems and its budget shortfalls. China has moved into California with infrastructure and port development, with buying up land and investing in infrastructure projects. Well, everyone knows that when that happens, China is effectively infiltrating the California political system, and it's effectively gaining, undermining U.S. sovereignty over what moves through the ports and what happens, on the land and whatnot. But the fact is California needs the money, and the executive class in California has made that bargain. No doubt it's lining many of their own pockets, but the fact is this is part of the push and pull of diplomacy. And as long as the partner is not severely mistreating you, you can see how the interests with USAID and with foreign governments does not have to be what it is today. It does not always have to be a dirty trick to regime change the government, but it has turned into that because we have had a foreign policy establishment who has gotten so cocky, has become so non-responsive to complaints by its counterparts because it just presupposes that it can always get rid of a democratically elected foreign leader if they don't do what USAID or the State Department tells them to do, that they just do it willy-nilly now. And the rest of the world watches in horror as this Leviathan just grows and grows until the present day, when it really took Trump and Elon for the first time to really take this on. And I think every single federal agency's international affairs branch has to be audited. There's only a handful of nominally foreign-facing agencies in the federal government. The State Department is not allowed to operate on U.S. soil. It's a foreign-facing agency. The Pentagon is not allowed to operate on U.S. soil. It's a foreign-facing agency. The CIA is a foreign-facing agency. It's not allowed to operate at home. It has to be a foreign-facing agency. Pretty much all of the other same thing with USAID. USAID is not allowed to operate on U.S. soil. It's supposed to be a foreign-facing agency. But pretty much every other department in the federal government is domestic. It is primarily relating to the regulation and management of affairs on the homeland rather than abroad in the American empire. Just as the foreign-facing restriction can be evaded to do dirty work at home, for example, the CIA can cite something called counterintelligence to operate at home. If they believe that you are a witting or unwitting asset of a foreign intelligence agency, that you're working with the Russians or being used by the Russians, the CIA can do surveillance on U.S. citizens. If USAID is working to influence the political affairs in Malaysia by funding media organs to do propaganda in Malaysia, it can fund those media organizations for their Malaysia work, but now those same media organizations can operate at home to do propaganda at home, and they're now having their revenues and profits padded by the Malaysia work from USAID. So they don't even need to make as much money at home. They can hire more people and staff. They can be more prolific. They can be weaponized domestically. So there are ways to end run the restriction on domestic activity. But so too it is with the domestic ones can operate internationally and in turn financially profit the domestic-facing political actors. And some examples of this are the Department of Labor. Right now, it is the unions who are spearheading these Tesla terrorist attacks. These are unions like the SEIU, the AFL-CIO. We see tons of people from the teachers workers and the UAW, which had a big war with Elon Musk, the United Auto Workers Union, who are all the unions are all over the JFK files. There's a lot of there was a lot of talk in the JFK assassination theory crafting around the role of the Teamsters and the mysterious death of Jimmy Hoffa and whatnot. But the fact is the unions have been the long arm of the Central Intelligence Agency for coming up on a century now. The unions are the workers groups, the trade laborers. They are the rough and tumble, blue collar, boots on the grounds. They are easily paid to do rent-a-riot work. If you need 1,000 people on the street for a protest, the easiest way is to go to a union to get that done, because the union all moves in a union. If management of that particular union says everybody needs to go and do this, they do that professionally anyway. When they do picketing or strikes or boycotts, that is part of how you shut down the machinery of a government. The government only works if the private sector and civil society institutions are working. The government can't send, for example, the police to drive to the scene of a crime to put down a protest if another set of protesters have shut down that highway and have 1,000 people blocking that highway. They have one of two choices at that point. They can either run them over and cause 1,000 casualties, or they can, give it up and not enforce the police activity to put out, the fires in another part of town. And through this method of getting boots on the ground and provoking police crackdowns, which then allows you to put sanctions on them through the international community, these unions are the first place we go when we try to overthrow a government. We will go to the miners' unions. We'll go to the teachers' unions. We'll go to the hospital workers' unions. And then people become much more responsive to the demands to overthrow, to regime change a government, because now their kids aren't in school, because the teachers aren't there. Now their elder parents and grandparents can't get health care, can't get medical services because the hospital workers have all walked out. They can't get food because the agricultural workers have all left. The businesses start to support the regime change because the miners have walked out, so they can't even access their own supply chains. And so these unions have been penetrated for, as I mentioned, almost a century now, by intelligence, because it's the first place we go in order to try to get a huge portion of a foreign country's population on our payroll and willing to move in unison to coerce a government to do or not do a particular thing, or to induce a regime change. The largest union in the United States is called the AFL-CIO. That union is penetrated, or was in the 1960s and 70s, it was commonly known as the AFL-CIA, because its international branches were used in virtually every sensitive country by the CIA. If the CIA wanted to organize a regime change in Brazil, it would work with the AFL-CIO's international branches in Brazil. If it wanted to induce a regime change against de Gaulle in France, it would work with the dock workers, AFL-CIO's dock worker union affiliates in France. It would do the same thing in Hungary, for example. It would do the same thing in Poland. In Poland, Lech Walesa, the Solidarity movement, was a union movement top to bottom. They were given something like $70 million in duffel bags of cash by the Central Intelligence Agency to build out and capacity build that union network. Today, to this very day, the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA cutout conceived of in the office of the CIA in 1983, and whose founders said that they were set up to do what the CIA used to do, and that specifically it was terrible for the CIA to be seen as subsidizing political dissident groups. That's why the endowment was created, in the direct words of the founder, to do that subsidy work that the CIA used to do, but without it looking like it's coming from the CIA. The CIA gets a copy of every grant the National Endowment for Democracy does, and the National Endowment for Democracy's union arm, that is their work with unions, is called the Solidarity Center, which again was the major CIA-backed union group in Poland that serves as the model for what we do now. In every single country, I showed how something like over $20 million had been given by the Biden Department of Labor International Affairs Bureau to the unions in Brazil that were working to topple Bolsonaro and promote Lula. It appears to be a patent payoff to the union assets. Lula in Brazil is a union creation. His party is called the Workers' Party. And who was on the ground, pushing Lula's campaign every step of the way, who was actually there specifically to meet Lula the day he got out of prison, and that frequently meets directly with Lula. It was the AFL-CIO. Meanwhile, you have these AFL-CIO affiliates who are receiving tens of millions of dollars from the Biden Department of Labor International Affairs branch. What I'm saying is this is a State Department function. This is a CIA, USAID function, but they're getting their money through the Department of Labor International Affairs Bureau. I believe a full review of the International Affairs Bureau of every single federal agency has to be done. The Department of Housing and Urban Development does international affairs work. That has to be assessed with the same meticulous level of detail that's being done at USAID. The Department of Labor, the Department of Education, the Department of Agriculture, every single one of these international affairs branches can effectively set their own foreign policy if they are not held in check, and they can work to promote networks that are actively trying to regime change the President of the United States itself. So every single one of these, the International Affairs Group, has to be looked at with the same fine-tooth comb that's being done right now at State and USAID. Okay, so the last thing that I want to emphasize here is how rogue policy setting by unchecked foreign policy institutions like USAID or State or CIA can impact domestic affairs can be seen in another memo that was pointed out by Mario. He did a post called JFK Files, Secret CIA Memorandum Outlines Plan to Isolate Castro and Destabilize Cuban Intelligence. And in this document, the CIA sets out how they believed at the time, after the failure of the Bay of Pigs, that there was no direct, immediate way to overthrow Castro in Cuba, and that was what was required instead was a massive commitment from Congress in terms of money and manpower beyond these special operations being done in the form of Bay of Pigs. But the CIA was frustrated that that political will from Congress did not exist. And there's an incredible passage in this where the CIA says this is an unrealistic objective, however, except on a very long-term basis as the United States government, we believe will be unwilling in the immediate future to commit troops to support such an overthrow. In view of these factors, the so-called Track 2 course of action, i.e. unlimited support of Cuban exiles and exile groups with no real control or objective purpose, in the hope that these groups will be able to shake the Castro regime, will, although unrealistic, become increasingly attractive at various levels in the United States government. What they're saying here is, since we can't get Congress to take the action we want them to, we don't have the authority because the American people are not voting for what we really want to do, the other option we have is to just do mass immigration of these exile communities of immigrants and refugees. And over time, if we give unlimited support to these exile groups, they will form enough of a lobby on themselves to affect the internal politics of Congress. They will lean on their Congress people. They will, if we give them over time unlimited support, they will lobby for the thing that we don't currently have, because every new refugee we bring in becomes a lobbyist on our behalf. And as we're paying for their lifestyles and giving them, quote, unlimited support with no real control or objective purpose, you see this happening, for example, with all the different exile groups and refugee groups that are being brought in by the U.S. military. We saw this play out in Springfield, Ohio, last year with the Haitian migrants being imported into Ohio by the U.S. military with the support of Governor Mike DeWine, who was trying to build up military infrastructure and Pentagon contracts in the state of Ohio. Well, the more exile communities you bring in from Haiti, the more political support there is to do political action in Haiti. We see the same thing in Somalia with importing tens of thousands of Somalians into Minneapolis, Minnesota. Lo and behold, that produces a congresswoman like Ilhan Omar, who then goes and advocates on behalf of the Obama foreign policy for Somalia and Eritrea and Kenya and the whole region. You bring in the people from Venezuela, they will advocate for that foreign policy in Venezuela. So what we see is the CIA saying, dang, we're not authorized to do this. So our short-term strategy isn't working. But if we do mass immigration and refugee programs, then over time, we'll eventually get the consent of the people to do this, because our own assets that we're bringing in are going to turn the tide on what the will of the people means. And so I think that seeing that in writing from the Cloak and Dagger Central Intelligence Agency 60 years ago, and that we're dealing with the same issue right now as we take on the immigration issue, really is a sort of back to the future moment.